I'll pass the ball as quickly as possible to Jake.
Okay, and just double checking, Carlo, that you can see my screen from that.
Let's see, yes.
And you can hear me okay?
Yes, it's perfect now.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to present here. What I'd like to cover in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is a little bit around aerobic field testing, specifically the utilisation of potentially novel fitness tests. My contact details are at the bottom, so please do feel free to get in touch with me and ask any questions you have to, and we'll just go on a quick whistle-stop tour of critical speed concept. So essentially what I'm proposing, or to give a little bit of background around what we're discussing here, is the use of a fitness test in order to ascertain the physical capacity, specifically the aerobic capacity and some other metrics of our footballers. It's potentially one of those things that's going to be particularly important at the moment, given after quite a long period of less structured training at the start and then end of pre-season, we'll be moving into this position of testing phase and then monitoring throughout the season and with regular testing. Currently, there's these two almost fields of views. There's a split between the current fitness test that you've probably received. I think most practitioners will be well aware and well versed in the difference between an intermittent test such as the yo-yo, the VIFT, 30-15, etc., versus a linear test, which is where I really want to focus quite a bit of our time at the moment. In essence, there's a difference between whether or not we're testing sport or are we testing the capacity. And what I mean by that is work that Sif and Verkhoshansky did, looking at dynamic correspondence. If we look at some of the work that other colleagues have done into the area of football, we know that heart rate on average sits above 85 to 95% of the maximum value for a match. VO2 is around 70% of maximum for the duration. And then we get into things like the total distance covered in a professional or elite setting. We're talking 10 to 13 kilometers per match. And with then a number of fatiguing actions, that is, number of turns, jumps, headers, accelerations, decelerations, equaling up to potentially 700 changes of direction per match. And this kind of leads down the first view that we should have an intermittent-based field test. However, we need to consider that the majority of a football match is actually spent at relatively low intensity. The 28% roughly of a football match will be spent somewhere along the lines of what we'd class as high intensity activity. And certainly that's a dictator between the different levels that we have at the moment, that as you move up through the levels, from elite football to sub-elite football, we'll see 60% more sprinting compared to lower levels. However, we end up with a difficulty in measuring this. So if we want to measure physical capacity, if we want to measure how fit our players are across different positions, their ability to take part in training and then in competitive matches, do we measure their physical ability or do we measure the capacities that we believe they have in the sport? One difficulty of using the yo-yo test is that it doesn't differentiate differences between the levels. That if you look at elite levels and sub-elite levels, it can predict a VO2 max. And there's a VO2 max that's suitable to take part in football at any level. And then we need to look at kind of the nature of the sport itself, in that it's a complete random set of events. That yes, we have a demand for lower level recovery pace as we move through sport, that we have a lower demand, lower intensity, but we also have these fatigue actions. But they take place in non-linear, acyclical fashion, and it's intermittent, it's randomness in its measure and what we do. If we're using these prescriptive tests of an intermittent test, well, how intermittent should it be? When should the most fatiguing or difficult aspects be from it? If we put that to one side and then look at the opposite and we look at a linear test, a linear test gives us this option to the mass run. So that's a consistent effort over a period of time without the change of directions biomechanically for fatiguing factors and things that we might potentially experience in there. But that's in itself not without its difficulties, because it doesn't include that randomness, that intermittent nature. It doesn't take into account its high intensity bursts that you have within a football match. So it leads us on to, do we move along a linear line or an intermittent line? And what I'd like to think about is that perhaps we should focus on what I call a class of the products, not the delivery. Maybe we need to look at one capacity or something over another test. So what I'd actually like to introduce you to is a little bit of background about this critical speed concept. And in its simplicity, critical speed is just the amount of work that you can do in a given time. If you were to assess a footballer or an athlete in another sport, predominantly within football for the nature of that, the more intense the action they'll complete, the more quickly they'll fatigue. The less intense the action that they'll complete, the less they'll fatigue. And then that leads us to what I've used down in the bottom right-hand corner as this battery concept. That if we measure an athlete in a sub-maximal test, we can then predict how quickly they'll fatigue and how much we'll move over. If we put them in a more demanding situation, again, the battery will deplete faster. That's in essence this idea of the critical speed concept. So critical speed is representative of your aerobic capacity. It's the amount of work that can be done by working muscles, the oxygen uptake, all of those other velocity of VO2 max, etc. From this concept, we know that for a given work capacity, how much or a quantifiable amount of work can be done, we can then predict a finite running capacity. That is speed above critical speed, above that fatiguing aspect that demarks what is intense activity. So kind of from this critical speed concept, we've got these two measures. We can see something that represents how long we'll be able to exercise for to fatigue at a given speed, and we can look at how quickly we can reach that if we were able to measure it above that line. All of this can be measured with a single time trial, a very short independent test, which should be an alternative to those intermittent and linear field tests that we've been speaking about previously. This is a little bit more about why this might be more appropriate as a test measure compared to some of the other methods we've got available to us. Is that if we start to look at the nature of the sport in itself, and we move away from trying to assess something from an intermittent fashion, from something that gets positively more demanding as you move through the exercise, like a mass run, where the most difficult aspect is at the end, we start to look around this idea that in actual fact, critical speed might offer a suitable alternative. So if we start to think about where time and power interact within this graph, the more demanding an exercise is, the less exercise a footballer is going to be able to do. And we start to think about the nature of the slope, so the curve of the graph in itself, how quickly that's going to decline. And it's true in critical speeds that the greater the fatigue during fast running, the more fatigue resistance will be produced. That is a function of velocity of VO2 max, your ability to meet lactate thresholds, etc. So what I'm essentially arguing is that there's a line where phosphocreatine will recover below a certain phase and almost entirely dependent on an athlete's aerobic capacity. And the basis for physical success in intermittent sports such as football, especially a non-cyclical one where there's a randomness involved in this, it's an interaction of two elements. We need high conditioning levels of aerobic capacity and aerobic power, as well as good levels of velocity, speed, muscle strength. So then how do we go about measuring this? So this is data that I've taken from a female mechanical footballer in England, playing a reasonable level of football, training several times a week. And in it, she's completed a critical power test. So there are different variants. But for the sake of this, I'm going to talk about 3-minute running test. So 3-minute running test is a maximal effort test, which begins with a high velocity effort at start. that is, the player will build up to their peak speed and then be required to maintain it for as long as they possibly can at the start of the test. Inevitably, what happens is that the player will fatigue, as you can see, over a period of time, they fatigue. And from this, we can then take several measures. The first one is the estimation of critical speed, an average speed of the last 30 seconds of the test. That speed is essentially a line in the sand for our athletes. Anything above that speed is going to accumulate fatigue and eventually will involve the athlete not being able to perform or perform in a maximum suboptimal environment. Anything below that critical speed line for this athlete means that they'll be able to recover. It will be at a slow enough pace that the muscle phosphate stores, the ATP, creatine phosphate, will be able to recover within that period of time. Next thing we want to look at is the maximum speed that can be achieved by our athlete. This correlates across to their speed achieved on a 40-meter sprint. In order for it to be a valid test, we need them to be achieving peak speed. They need to put maximal effort in at the start, and one way that you can validate this is to ensure that their peak speed running test, the aerobic test, is similar to that of a 40-meter sprint. The next measure we've been most interested in is the rate of speed decline. This is position specific, so this changes depending on where players are. Typically, your wingers and your fullbacks, very high peak speeds, but then a very rapid rate of speed decline afterwards, as befits the nature of their sport. What that does mean is that after a maximum effort, they're potentially less able to recover or need a greater duration to recover before they're able to replicate that maximum effort again. Equally, for players who are in more running environment, those central midfielders, central defenders within there have a slower rate of speed decline. The curve of the graph is slightly depressed for those players in that they're able to maintain a more maximal speed for longer than players in a different position until they reach speed. The last piece of information that we can take from this running test is the concept of a speed reserve. Knowing that we have their critical speed, the average speed that they can cover in the last 30 seconds of the test, that is their fatiguing and non-fatiguing speeds. We can then have their peak speed. We can then calculate the anaerobic speed reserve. That is how much or how quickly they fatigue at pace above their critical speed. It's not widely researched at present, but it's an area that it will have value to practitioners should you be wanting to use this as a measure for fitness tests within your athletes. So for our athletes, taking this average speed in the last 30 seconds is 2.1 meters per second, which you'll see is similar to that of a mass-based run. And some of the research I'll show you shortly has actually been looking at critical speed in comparison to a mass test. This is a finite run capacity, that is a distance that she can achieve maximum of 165 meters. She has her speed, and then we can also see her fatigue index, which is relatively good for a player of her position, but treading with an element of caution that the peak speed and her critical speed are probably below that what we would expect to see with somebody in her position. So the actual 3-minute running test itself, in terms of how does it work? So typically, if to run this with a squad of players, I'd use the full pitch and turn it into almost a linear running track. I'd split the team into 4, measured by GPS units, with one team starting each corner of the pitch, chasing each other in order to achieve that maximal peak speed at the start. And then, because it is a maximal test, it's a very lonely place for a footballer when they're running in a very fatigued state. They can chase down a group in front of them, so there's something to run at. They'll spend between 20 and 30 seconds at the start of the test at high speed. If I was to adopt to the team, I would advise them to build up to this within the first 50 to 100 meters rather than start maximum from the line for obvious reasons. And then they'll spend 20 to 30 seconds at that speed. Normative data that we're looking at currently shows us that they'll cover somewhere in the region of between 800 meters plus or minus, and this is for sub-elite and elite female players at the moment. So there's some research that's been conducted with rugby players that suggests a great distance. Reasons we'll talk about shortly. But then in terms of test validity itself, if I just slide back to the first slide, the peak speed we're looking at the start, they need to achieve peak speed, so I'll be correlating that to a 40-meter sprint test. But then also I'll be looking for some of the internal load measures. We're looking for the fact that the heart rate reaches near max within the 90% to start the test. It's correlated strongly with tests that have been conducted on the treadmill. And it will remain at that level for the remainder of the test. As I said, it's positionally specific. It changes depending on where players are. Certainly, central midfielders and central defenders hold higher critical speeds than their counterparts in wingers, strikers, and fullbacks. But it also has some value in a rehab setting, in that as a return to play protocol. It is a short duration test. There's, as I'll show you shortly, several different ways in which this can be conducted, which it could actually be conducted through the use of a watt bike to remove load to begin with, and then onto a graduated running protocol before you take on the full maximum. There are different modalities, as I suggested. This is some work conducted by Kramer and Petit, who've looked at a linear running version of the test, so where I would be prescribing either on an athletics track or on the outside of the pitch, versus 25-meter shuttle or 50-meter shuttle. Some of the research I've been reading around this area is that I would suggest that linear test might be more suitable for developing that aerobic capacity within athletes, as opposed to 25 or a 50-meter shuttle. But in terms of correlates between data, they sit within a margin of error with those tests that we would agree to be acceptable. Equally, there's a limited amount of normative data so far in the use of the test, but as the data exists and is showing what kind of the trends that we'd be expecting to see from a test of these. So in linear-based trained sports, critical speed is higher, whereas we move into field-based sports such as football, seeing that the critical speed is actually somewhat lower than that of athletes who compete in a linear fashion, which is expected. However, an aspect we'd be quite interested in is the ability to run above those critical speeds. So that is towards the intense anaerobic actions within a match, where we're seeing that D prime scores are significantly higher among field-based intermittent sports such as football than you would see in linear-based sports, due to the nature, those anti-cyclical nature of sports. Okay. So some data to show you, or potentially to start thinking about, in terms of where the 3-minute running test sits in comparison to other tests. It correlates extremely strongly with a mass test being a similar protocol, if somewhat reversed, in that the maximal effort is at the start of the test rather than at the end when the player is making a piece. Strong correlations with mass tests across all levels, ages, and genders. It's not as strongly correlated with VO2 tests. A potential reason for that could be the strength-based element that's involved in high-speed running and reduction of the biomechanical fatiguing aspect you experience within these sports, such as multiple turns. And for obvious reasons, it does, of course, correlate quite strongly with repeated sprint ability, that ability to work above the fatigue level. Implications for training. So if we were then to use the 3-minute running test as an area that you could prescribe for your teams, either in pre-season or throughout the season, the limited amount of data set in terms of normative data at the moment to benchmark your team against. You would have squad averages for your team, but there is little data so far to suggest how this compare elsewhere across levels, age groups, genders. Therefore, I'd recommend the use of it as a performance measure rather than a prescriptive measure. It is possible, and there are studies which have prescribed interval-based training using a 3-minute running test with some successes. However, at present, that's a limited area. Certainly in field-based sports, so at present, I'd recommend it as a performance benchmark and a prescriptive. Having said that, if you do prescribe from the 3-minute running test, the current associated data suggests that longer intervals will improve the running capacity. The maximal distance that an athlete can run at a 15 level above that their critical speed, whereas shorter intervals are associated with critical speed development in a similar way to that of which you see improved in a mass start run. There's a significant strength element associated with their finite running capacity, their ability to reach top speed and maintain that, as you would expect. And there's a wealth of information to suggest why that may occur. Moving forward, so where this research will go, there's a couple of areas which are probably quite predominant at the moment, and that is the use or the validity of a critical speed test, which is that of small-sided games. It's interesting that small-sided games don't reach a lactate threshold or maintain it in the same way that aerobic testing does. So it would be a suggestion that it might be worth introducing some running-based protocols as well as small-sided games. The benefit of critical speed testing in that it's very fast, very easy to conduct, and complete it with an entire team at the same time. And then a relationship between match-based data and that of critical speed, or D prime, in that are the peak speeds achieved on the critical speed test correlated to that of a match. The accelerations and decelerations that are involved in those, and the energetics of the 25 or 50 meter shuttle test and its relationship to critical speed. So whistle-stop tour of what Carlo and I spoke about several weeks ago before he asked me to do this. I'll be happy to take any questions if anybody has them. Again, details will be on that, and I'm happy to answer any at a later stage as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you. It's fine and interesting to have another point of view. The use of critical speed in football is not wide, but there are some challenges we can move over with these things. You explained us. Sorry, I changed the speakers.